Welcome back. So let's continue peeling the architecture layer and go one level deeper to discuss the components that make up the system. Let's look at the component diagram. So what is a component diagram? The definition part. A component diagram shows the various components in a system and their dependencies. Component represents a physical module of a code. Typically, during implementation, component is often the same as a package. So that's the quick definition. Next, let's look at the purpose of this diagram. The purpose of this component diagram is to identify the major components that make up the system, its structure and behavior. Component diagram zooms into individual container to show the component inside it. Another purpose of this diagram is to show the relationship between the different components that make up the system. The diagram is quite helpful in showing the information flow and also how a functionality of a component is exposed via an interface and how it's been consumed or utilized. So shown on the screen, the component diagram of the internet banking system example that we have been going through during the context and the container diagram discussion. So here, as you see, you have a web application UI and a mobile application UI component which talk to the customized service component. This component will talk to the security component to invoke all kinds of authentication and authorization services. Also, customer service component talks to the banking business service component to invoke business services functionality. Business service component talks to the mainframe banking system facade to interface with the core mainframe banking application. Similarly, business services component interfaces with the email facade. Now, what we see here is one variant of component diagram where interaction between component is depicted using arrows. So what it means is that one component uses services from another component. For example, web application UI uses services from customer UI component. The other variant to this diagram is using cup and cone diagram. It's same information that we had seen earlier, just that the presentation is different. Here the lollipop ball is a service and the cup is consumer of the service, or it's consuming the service. Again, in this case, we have a customer service component which exposes services which is consumed by web UI and mobile UI component. And services exposed by security component is consumed by customer services. Customer service consumes services which is exposed by banking business services component. So what we have seen is the two-way variation of drawing component diagram. So next we see who are the audiences of this diagram. So continuing, let's look at the audiences of this component diagram. As you must have seen, component diagram is a technical diagram in nature. So it may not be suitable for CEO, CIO, business users, product owners. So obviously, being a technical in nature, architect is definitely one of the important audience of this diagram. And this is the diagram where developers will start looking at this diagram and try to understand the purpose of the components, start getting into discussion that if the component need to be dissected further as a sub-components and so on. DevOps will be definitely interested as they start thinking what it will look like once these components are deployed. Production support team will be interested to see how the various components interacts with each other so that they are kind of well versed with the architecture of the application. So that's about the audience. Next, let's see when this component diagram will be used. So when this diagram is being used, the component diagram is used throughout the project and usually is refined as the project progresses. It's a useful diagram to get overview of the application architecture and overview of the project. So it's quite a handy tool during onboarding of new member into team. At this point, I'd like you to pause the video and take a look at what are the components that you could identify for AutoCab self-drive taxi application system. And draw your component diagram, and when you're done, continue with the video, and then I'll show you what I came up with, and then as we did for other diagrams, we'll do a quick comparison. Alright, here's my component diagram. Again, yours must be completely different from what I have drawn here, and that's absolutely fine. You may or may not have used cup and cone notation for drawing the component diagram, and that's absolutely okay. So we see more detail in component diagram as what we saw in container diagram. So we see analysis UI, which is for reporting purposes, and it will interface with reporting DB rather than online transaction database. So we see one more new component, and that's the reporting database. And there may be some type of ETL or transformation job happening to get data from the relational database to reporting database. Analysis services will be consuming data from the reporting database and exposing it to the analysis UI for reporting purposes. The customer, both mobile and web, will come via view services and consume business services, and similarly admin also will interact with the business services via view services. There is a security services which will be consumed by view services component to do some kind of authentication and authorization. Also note, there is a self-drive taxi component can consume and generate events. So there is a generator and a consume component which will be handling the generation and consuming of events. Component diagram provide an avenue for discussion that if everything has been taken into consideration, have we missed anything? Is this a right set of component? Is there any other component that we haven't thought about? So the primary use of component diagram is that it triggers these kinds of discussions. Again, these discussions are much easier and cheaper to discuss early on the project rather than later. In real life, this diagram undergo change and it gets refined as the project progresses. So that's about the component diagram. Any comments, question, please add it in the discussion forum or message me. I'll be more than happy to reply. Next, we'll look into sequence diagram.